When the AI enhancement revealed that the bride's skin was not skin at all, Elena Ward knew she had uncovered something that should have remained buried. She had no idea then that chasing this mystery would force her to confront the darkest corners of love itself, and that the bride's story would demand to be told. If stories like this remind you how easily history hides its secrets, hit that like button and subscribe so more forgotten moments can be brought back to light. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether you think we'll ever know the full truth behind what really happened. Enjoy the story. Elena Ward had spent the last 3 years of her life in the controlled hush of archives and digitization labs, where the past could be carefully cataloged, labeled, and filed into neat rows of data. As an art history graduate student at the University of Durham, she had learned to find meaning in decay, in the sepia fading of old prints, the foxing of delicate paper, the way time could be read like a language written in shadow and loss. The work was methodical, sometimes tedious, but it suited her. She had always been more comfortable with dead things than with living people. In the winter of 2025, the Department of Special Collections had hired her to help digitize a sprawling collection of Victorian photographs that had been donated by the estate of a reclusive antiquarian. The photographs had been bundled in deteriorating boxes, sealed away in an attic for nearly a century. Nobody knew much about them. Nobody, it seemed, had cared. On a Tuesday morning, Elena was working through a box labeled Miscellaneous Portraitures circa 1890 to 1930 when she found the wedding photograph. It was nestled between 2 daguerreotypes of stern-faced men in military dress, and at first glance it seemed unremarkable, just another faded Victorian wedding portrait, the kind you could find in any antique shop or dusty family album. The photograph showed a bride and groom posed in what appeared to be a formal parlor, standing before a painted backdrop of classical columns and draped fabric. The image was cracked down the center as if the frame had been dropped at some point, and the emulsion had faded to a pale, ghostly gray blue. But something about the bride drew Elena's eye. Not her beauty, though she was beautiful in that severe, formal way that all people seemed to be in old photographs, rendered ethereal by the camera's inability to capture movement or warmth. It was something about her stillness, the way she stood beside her groom, her hand resting on his arm, her face turned slightly toward the lens. There was a quality to her immobility that felt less like Victorian propriety and more like something else, something closer to suspension, as if she had been paused mid-breath. Elena ran the photograph through the restoration software that evening, working late in the climate-controlled lab, the hum of servers the only sound in the darkened space. The program was designed to enhance degraded images, to lift fading details from damaged negatives, to return lost clarity to the past. As the algorithm worked, rendering line by line across her monitor, Elena watched the bride's face emerge from the digital fog. The enhancement was subtle at first, a softer definition to the jawline, a clearer rendering of the eyes. But then, in the magnified details around the bride's temples and along her cheekbone, the program revealed something that made Elena lean closer to the screen. The skin was not merely pale or faded. Across the surface, in a pattern almost like frost crystallization, ran what appeared to be microscopic fractures, tiny lines of breakage that seemed to follow the architecture of bone beneath. They ran in geometric patterns, geometric and uniform, in a way that no natural human face could produce. It was as if the bride's skin had been carefully applied like porcelain veneer, and that veneer had begun, very slightly, to crack. Elena's first assumption was that the AI had generated an artifact, that the restoration algorithm, confused by the damaged original, had misinterpreted the surface of the photograph and created an illusion of fracture where none existed. She ran the restoration again, using different settings, different parameters. The fractures appeared in every iteration. She zoomed deeper, examining the pixel data, looking for signs of digital error. But the pattern was too consistent, too intentional. It was as if the pattern had always been there, waiting in the faded emulsion, waiting for technology to evolve enough to make it visible. It was then that Elena made the decision that would consume the next 6 months of her life. She began to search the archive for other photographs featuring the same bride. The search took days of methodical work. Elena fed the bride's facial features into a facial recognition program, a tool not typically used in archive work, but which she had accessed through her university's computer vision laboratory. She ran the algorithm across 347 photographs from the collection. Most results were false positives, similar faces, similar era, similar pose. But among those false results, there were matches. Clear, undeniable matches. The bride appeared again in 1903 in a different studio, wearing a different wedding dress, her groom a different man. The photograph was in better condition than the first, and the AI enhancement revealed the same microscopic fractures, the same impossible uniformity of features. She appeared again in 1909. This time, the studio backdrop had changed to a garden scene. In 1918, in 1922, in 1929, 6 weddings, 6 different grooms, 6 different studios, or so Elena initially believed. But the bride never aged, never changed. The only variations were in her clothing and in the subtle degradation of the photograph itself as it moved deeper into the 20th century. But the face, that face remained exactly the same. Exactly the same. Elena sat in the quiet archive lab in the middle of the night, pulling up all 6 images side by side on her monitor. She magnified the bride's eyes in each photograph, identical. She measured the precise angle of the bride's cheekbones using digital calipers, identical. She overlaid the images digitally, scaling them to account for depth of field differences and lens distortion. When she placed one bride's face over another, they aligned with such precision that she appeared to be the same photograph, repeated, only the frame and background changed. The impossibility of it made her hands shake. Elena looked at the clock. It was 4:53 in the morning. She had been working for nearly 17 hours without stopping. The archive was dark around her except for the glow of the monitor, and that light seemed very far away. She zoomed in on the bride's expression across all 6 images simultaneously, staring at that serene, composed face, that face that never smiled, never changed, never seemed to inhabit the moment in which it was being recorded. The expression was the same in every photograph, lifeless, patient, eternal, as if the bride was looking not at the camera but through time itself, waiting for someone 130 years in the future to finally recognize what she was. When Elena finally left the lab to drive home through the gray, pre-dawn streets of Durham, she had only one question turning over and over in her mind. Who was this woman? And how could she remain unchanged while the world around her aged and died? The next morning, Elena began searching through the archive's microfilm collection, scrolling through registries and marriage documents from the years corresponding to each photograph. The work was tedious, eye-straining, the kind of archival research that most scholars spent years training themselves to love. Elena found herself consumed by it. She barely left the building. In the marriage registry for East Yorkshire, filed under the year 1897, she found the first entry, a wedding between one Mr. Edmund Garrett of Leeds and Miss Charlotte Blackwood of Whitby, witnessed by 2 individuals whose names were written in a careful hand. The registry notation indicated that the ceremony had taken place on the 23rd of June, 1897, at the parish church in Whitby. The photograph, Elena knew this now with certainty, must be from that day, but there was no second marriage record for Charlotte Blackwood. Instead, what Elena found, scrolling through subsequent years, was a pattern. A woman who appeared once every 4 to 7 years, always wearing white, always married, always the exact same age. But each time she had a different name: Elizabeth Hartwell in 1903, Margaret Ashford in 1909, Victoria Summerson in 1918. The names were different. The locations varied across England, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Surrey. The records scattered across different parish files and municipal archives. But the bride was always the same, and in every case the grooms shared a curious fate. Edmund Garrett, first groom, had died in October of 1897, less than 4 months after his June wedding. The record, filed in a separate death registry, simply stated sudden illness as the cause. Thomas Wickham, the second groom, who had married Elizabeth Hartwell in 1903, had perished the following year in an accident at his estate, thrown from a horse. Margaret Ashford's husband in 1909, one James Rothschild, had disappeared in 1910, his fate recorded in the parish records only as presumed drowned. The pattern continued through all 6 weddings. Dead husbands, dead grooms, a bride left waiting. Elena contacted Dr. Marcus Finley, a Victorian photography expert who taught at the University of Leeds, and invited him to examine the photographs. They met on a Thursday afternoon in a private viewing room at the archive. Finley was a meticulous man in his 60s with silver hair and an archivalist's precision in the way he handled the prints, using cotton gloves and examining each image under careful light. "The photographic technique is interesting," Finley noted, adjusting his magnifying glass. "The focus work, the studio lighting, this is professional work, but the studios appear to have changed. See the backdrop texture here in the first image?" He pointed to the painted column behind the couple. "This is consistent with a particular photographic house in Whitby, but this later image, from 1922, shows a different backdrop preparation, different studio. The negative is from a different photographer, or at least from a different studio setup." "Is that unusual?" Elena asked, knowing the answer already but needing to hear it, confirmed from someone who knew better than she did. It would suggest the bride traveled to different studios to have her portrait taken, or more likely, that these photographs were taken in different locations by different photographers over an extended period. Finley looked up from the magnifying glass. "Though I should note, there's something unusual about the studio in the first photograph. This particular backdrop style and the lighting work. I'm fairly certain this came from Arthur Hemsley and Company's studio in Whitby. I've seen similar work in a collection at the Whitby Museum. Hemsley was known for his technical innovations." Elena felt something shift in her chest. Arthur Hemsley, a reclusive fellow, worked in Whitby in the mid to late Victorian period. Quite brilliant from what I've read, but eccentric. He was more famous for his wax portraitures than his photography, actually. There are rumors that he experimented with combining sculptural techniques with photographic processes, creating what he called lifelike portraits, hybrid works that blurred the line between photograph and statue. Finley turned back to the first image. "But look here, do you see these markings on the border? Very faint." He pointed to a barely visible embossed mark on the edge of the photograph. "The maker's mark. It reads A.H. and Cumino Portraitures, Whitby." This photograph definitely came from Hemsley's studio. "What happened to him?" Elena asked quietly. "Hemsley?" "There was a fire," Finley said, his tone becoming more somber. "In 1901, I believe. The studio burned down. Hemsley and his wife died in the fire, if I'm remembering correctly. It was something of a scandal at the time. There were rumors, though I can't verify them, that he'd been engaged in some manner of unorthodox experiments, but nothing concrete. The records from that period are sparse. Elena thanked him and let him leave, promising to keep him updated if she found anything remarkable. But she already knew that what she was going to find would not feel remarkable so much as it would feel impossible. That evening, she searched the newspaper archives for articles about Arthur Hemsley. The Whitby Gazette, dated January 16, 1901, carried a brief notice about the fire. A tragic conflagration claimed the studio of Mr. Arthur Hemsley, the prominent photographer and artist, on the morning of January 10th. The fire spread with great rapidity, consuming the building and its contents. Mr. Hemsley and his wife, Clara, were believed to be within the studio at the time, and their remains have not yet been recovered. The cause of the fire remains under investigation by local authorities. Clara, the wife's name was Clara. Elena pulled more records, searching for anything related to Clara Hemsley. What she found was fragmentary, a marriage notice from 1895, listing a marriage between Arthur Hemsley and Miss Clara Ashworth, an advertisement from 1898 for Hemsley's special portrait treatments, and then, buried in the Whitby Museum's acquisitions list, from 1907, a single notation: unidentified porcelain mask fragment, recovered from debris of Hemsley studio fire, donor unknown, condition, severe heat damage, material composition, high-fired ceramic with traces of pigmentation and glaze. Elena stood in the viewing room, staring at the archival entry, her hands trembling slightly. She thought of the bride's face, fractures running across it like porcelain that had been exposed to intense heat, and then somehow, impossibly, restored, perfectly restored, eternally restored. She made a phone call to the Whitby Museum and requested access to the recovered artifact. The curator, a woman named Dr. Sarah Oaksham, agreed to meet with Elena the following Saturday. As Elena hung up the phone, she found herself staring at the 6 wedding photographs once more. 6 brides in white, all the same woman, all with that eerily serene expression, that fracture pattern running across her face like a secret written in broken porcelain, all wearing the same empty, patient smile. The question that had kept Elena awake for the past week now transformed into something darker. What if the bride was not human? And what if the fire in 1901 had not destroyed her, but had only been the first chapter of her impossible afterlife? The train to Whitby took 2 hours from Durham, and Elena spent the entire journey staring out the window at the gray English countryside, watching it shift from industrial flatness to rolling moorland. She had printed out copies of all 6 wedding photographs and brought them in a protective folder. She had also printed every scrap of information she could find about Arthur Hemsley, about Clara Hemsley, about that fire in 1901 that had supposedly ended both of their lives. The museum was located in the medieval quarter of Whitby, in a stone building that overlooked the harbor. Dr. Oaksham was waiting for her in the climate-controlled archives, a woman in her mid-50s with warm eyes and the particular kind of patience that came from a lifetime of handling fragile things. "The artifact is quite remarkable," Oaksham said, leading Elena through narrow corridors lined with cabinet after cabinet of objects. "Unusual, really. The mask fragment survived the fire. We believe it was deep enough in the ruins, perhaps in a storage area, that it was protected by stone or other materials. It's a study in contrasts, actually. Severe heat damage on one side, but the other side shows traces of the original glaze work, pigmentation. Someone was quite skilled in its creation." They entered a conservation room where the artifact lay on a padded table under careful lighting. It was about the size of a human face, roughly the right dimensions for a mask that might cover cheek and temple. The ceramic was blackened on one surface, Heat cracked into a spiderweb pattern, but on the other side, visible despite the damage and centuries of oxidation, were the ghost remains of delicate work. Elena could see traces of pigmentation, subtle variations in tone that suggested careful modeling of flesh. There was even, if you looked at it the right way, the impression of an eye socket, perfectly formed, empty. Elena felt a cold sensation move through her chest. "Do you know what this is?" she asked Oaksham quietly. "What this mask was for?" "Not with certainty," Oaksham replied. "But we have theories. There were some photographs in Hemsley's personal collection. We retrieved what we could from the fire damage that suggested he was experimenting with what he called preservation portraiture. There's a letter, partially burned, that we found among his effects. It's in our restricted archive. Would you like to see it?" Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The letter was preserved in our archival case. The paper blackened at the edges, the ink faded but still legible in places. It appeared to be a personal letter written in a careful hand, and it was addressed to someone named Henry, though the sender's name was obscured. But as Elena read the fragments, her breath caught. "She will not fade," one section read. "My bride shall endure, even if flesh betrays her. The kiln holds at 1,000 degrees. The glaze will seal her. She will be perfect. She will be eternal." "Who is this from?" Elena asked. "We believe it was written by Hemsley," Oaksham said carefully. "The handwriting matches some other known samples of his writing, but this is not something we've published or made widely known. The contents are disturbing." Elena's hands had begun to shake again. She thought of the 6 photographs, the identical faces, the bride who never aged, never changed, who appeared at a different altar every 4 to 7 years, always in white, always serene, always wearing that expression of a woman who had been perfectly preserved. "I need to ask you something," Elena said, and she pulled out the folder containing the wedding photographs. "Have you ever seen this woman before?" Oaksham examined the photographs carefully, one by one. When she looked up, her expression had changed. Her warmth had been replaced by something closer to concern. "This is impossible," Oaksham said softly, "but I recognize her. Or I recognize a face very similar to this one, from a portrait sketched in Hemsley's personal journals, a portrait he labeled Clara, 1896. But that would mean—" She trailed off, looking back at the wedding photographs, looking at the bride's identical face, spanning 6 decades. That would mean this woman never aged. "Or never died," Elena said. Oaksham said nothing for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner of the archive room. She withdrew a journal, bound in leather, its pages water-stained and smoke-darkened. She opened it carefully, turning to a marked page. The sketch was crude, but unmistakable. It was the bride, the same face that stared out from all 6 wedding photographs. Below the sketch, in Hemsley's careful hand, were written 3 lines. "My Clara, before the kiln, before the transformation. She is most beautiful when she is most still. Soon she will be still forever." Elena closed her eyes. The motion was so profound, so utterly horrible in its implications, that she had to sit down. Oaksham brought her a glass of water. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. "I think I know what happened," Elena finally said. And as she spoke, the pieces clicked together with a terrible, inevitable logic. Hemsley's wife, Clara, she was ill, wasn't she? She was dying. "I don't have enough information to confirm that," Oaksham said cautiously. "But you suspect it?" "Perhaps. There are some medical records from Whitby at that time. Clara Hemsley consulted several physicians in the years before the fire. The records indicate some kind of wasting illness, possibly tuberculosis or similar. She was young, perhaps only 25 or 26, and facing her own mortality." "So Hemsley did something," Elena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't accept that she was going to die, that beauty and youth were going to betray him. So he transformed her. He created something that could never die, never fade, never change. He turned his dying wife into porcelain. "You're suggesting he created some kind of hybrid object," Oaksham said slowly. "A sculpture that was also a photograph. A woman who was also an artwork." "I'm suggesting," Elena said, "that something catastrophically impossible happened in that studio in Whitby in the months before 1897. And whatever that something was, it did not end when the fire burned in 1901. If anything, the fire preserved it, because after that fire she was reborn. She began appearing in photographs again, with different names, with different grooms, always exactly the same, always exactly preserved." Elena pulled out her phone and showed Oaksham the digital analysis she had conducted, the image overlay that showed all 6 brides perfectly aligned, the spectral analysis that had revealed trace pigments and glaze patterns consistent with ceramic material, not human skin, the reflection analysis that showed the groom visible in one photograph's mirror, but the bride casting no reflection at all. As Oaksham examined the data, the color seemed to drain from her face. "If this is real," Oaksham said very quietly, "then this is not a historical curiosity. This is evidence of something outside the natural order. This is evidence of something that should not exist." Elena gathered her materials and thanked Oaksham for her time. She promised to keep in touch, to share her findings when she had verified them more thoroughly. But as she walked out of the museum and back down the cobbled streets of Whitby toward the harbor, she could not shake a growing sense of dread. She had found a fragment of the truth, but the truth she was beginning to understand was not complete. It was only the beginning of something far stranger. That night, staying in a small hotel overlooking the harbor, Elena lay in bed and dreamed of a woman made of porcelain, turning her head very slowly, looking directly at the camera, looking directly at Elena, and in the dream the woman's lips moved, and she whispered something that Elena could almost understand, something about a kiln, something about beauty, something about a bride who could not die because she had never truly been alive. When Elena returned to the archive, she downloaded the spectral analysis software used by museum conservators, the kind of equipment that could read the molecular composition of objects by analyzing the light they reflected. She applied it to high-resolution scans of all 6 wedding photographs. The results were so clear, so undeniable, that she had to run the analysis 5 more times to be certain she was reading the data correctly. The bride's face across all 6 photographs showed consistent traces of ceramic glaze, silicon dioxide, metallic oxides, trace elements of cobalt and iron. The composition was consistent with high-fired porcelain, the kind of material that had been used in fine art and sculpture for centuries. It was not human skin. It had never been human skin, but there was something else in the data, something that made Elena's breath catch. When she performed a digital alignment of all 6 brides, scaling for photographic distortion and depth of field variation, the faces aligned with a precision that transcended human variation. The measurements were identical to within a fraction of a millimeter. The bone structure, the muscle tone, the subtle planes of the face, all of it was exactly, impossibly the same. Not similar, not close, identical. It was as if all 6 brides were not 6 separate instances of the same woman, but rather 6 instances of the same object. A template, a sculpture reproduced exactly. Elena became consumed by the work. She barely left the lab. She ran the analysis over and over, trying to find some flaw in her methodology, some error that would explain the impossible precision of the data. There was none. The bride's face was mathematically perfectly preserved across 6 photographs spanning 32 years. And then Elena discovered something in one of the photographs that changed everything. It was the 1909 image, the one where the bride appeared as Margaret Ashford. The photographer had used a technique common in the early 20th century, positioning the couple in front of a mirror to create a sense of depth and dimension. In the reflected image of that mirror, visible in the background of the photograph, was another figure, the groom, reflected, his image repeated in the glass. But the bride's reflection was not there. Elena enlarged the image, zoomed in on the mirror region, enhanced the contrast. She ran the spectral analysis on the mirror space where the bride's reflection should have appeared. It was empty. Nothing. The groom was reflected perfectly, his face and body clear in the glass. But the space where the bride should have been reflected was blank, as if she had no substance, no presence in the world of reflections, as if she existed only in the camera's eye and nowhere else. That night, Elena could not sleep. She spent the small hours of the morning wandering through the archive building, moving through the corridors of catalogued history, surrounded by the accumulated traces of lives lived and lost. She thought about what it meant to be frozen in time, what it meant to be made of porcelain, what it meant to be the object of someone's love so profound that he had transformed her death into an art form. She returned to her flat and sat at her desk, and she began to write. The analysis took 3 weeks to complete. Elena meticulously documented every piece of evidence: the maker's mark, the marriage records, the death records of all 6 grooms, the spectral analysis, the reflection anomaly, the letter from Hemsley mentioning the kiln, the recovered porcelain mask fragment. She compiled it all into a document that read like either the most brilliant art historical analysis or the delusional ravings of someone who had spent too long alone with old photographs. She wasn't certain which. Then came the night when her computer did something it should not have been able to do. Elena had been running the AI restoration program on the original 1897 photograph, the first bride, the first instance of Clara. The software was designed to enhance and reconstruct fading images, to fill in corrupted data based on patterns in the surrounding image. It was a sophisticated program, the product of machine learning trained on thousands of historical photographs. As Elena watched, the program generated a new frame, not a reconstruction of the original photograph, but an advancement of it, a continuation. A new image showing the bride, still in her wedding dress, but now her head had turned. She was looking directly into the lens. Her porcelain face was visible in full frontal view, and her eyes, those perfectly rendered, perfectly identical eyes, were open and staring directly at Elena through the screen. Elena's computer froze. A burst of static filled the monitor, a sound like wind or like burning or like something breaking. And then the monitor went black. Elena jerked back from the desk, her heart hammering in her chest. She waited, breathing, her hands shaking. After a moment, the monitor flickered back to life. The original photograph had returned. The bride was in her original position, looking away from the camera, her expression serene and unchanged. But something was different now. Elena could feel it. Some line had been crossed. Some boundary between the past and the present had been breached. Over the next week, the story began to fragment and spread. The museum servers that housed the archive began displaying corrupted files, wedding photographs from the digital collection, all showing the same bride, all of them corrupted with the same glitching effect that Elena's computer had shown. Security footage from the archive building captured strange anomalies, files moving between servers on their own, timestamps shifting, images appearing in folders where they had not been stored. And then Elena saw the news report. A curator at the London National Archive had been reviewing digitized photographs from the early 20th century when he encountered a woman he did not recognize in a wedding portrait. A woman, the curator noted, who had appeared in multiple different photographs across the collection, in different eras, in different locations, always identically unchanged. The curator had flagged the anomaly as evidence of either a database corruption or a deliberate attempt to introduce false data into the archive. But then other institutions reported the same phenomenon. A museum in Manchester found the same woman in their collection. A photographer's studio archive in Liverpool contained what appeared to be multiple instances of her face. The anomalies were spreading, moving from archive to archive, from server to server, as if the bride was being restored, reawakened, brought back into the world through the medium of digital data. Elena sat in her flat, surrounded by printed photographs, surrounded by notes and analysis and the desperate evidence of an impossible truth. She pulled up the current date on her computer. The calendar showed 1931, the year after the last wedding photograph. But no, that was not right. She looked again. 2025, present day, the year in which she lived. Except something had changed in the historical records she was reviewing. In the digital archive of the Whitby Gazette, she found a photograph she did not remember seeing before. It was dated 1930, and it showed a wedding ceremony. Two people stood at the altar, the bride in white, the groom in formal dress, and the bride's face was identical to all the others. But this photograph had not been in the archive before. Elena was certain of it, unless it had been there all along, waiting until someone finally restored it to clarity. Elena traveled to Whitby again, this time with a specific purpose. She had located, through careful research in old court records, reference to an inquest held in 1899. It was a sealed inquest, its records closed by order of the magistrate at the time. But Elena had found a name. The solicitor who had handled the sealing of the records was still alive, according to some genealogical records, until 1967. His son was still living in Whitby. The son, a man named Robert Ashworth, now 92 years old, agreed to meet with Elena in his home overlooking the harbor. He was frail but sharp-eyed, and he had something to tell her. "My father," Ashworth said, his voice thin but steady, "was present at the inquest. He was not the solicitor, but he worked as a clerk in the law offices at the time. He was there when the magistrate ordered the records sealed, and he kept a personal journal." Ashworth retrieved a handwritten diary from a locked cabinet. He opened it carefully, turning to a marked page, and he read to Elena from entries dated 1899. The magistrate held the inquest into the matter of Arthur Hemsley. Ashworth read, "The matter concerned the death of a woman, the wife of Hemsley, and her subsequent preservation. The magistrate was presented with testimony from Hemsley's apprentices and colleagues. The testimony described a process, a woman ill beyond the reach of modern medicine, a man who could not accept her death, and a procedure performed in Hemsley's studio in the night hours of December 18th, 1898. Ashworth looked up from the diary. "My father wrote that the testimony was so extraordinary, so impossible, that the magistrate could not bring himself to file the proper charges. How could you charge a man with murder if the victim was not murdered but transformed? How could you prosecute a crime that did not fit into the categories of law and reason?" "What was the procedure?" Elena asked quietly. Ashworth read again. "The apprentices testified that Hemsley had prepared a ceramic mold of his wife's face and neck, constructed with precise anatomical detail. The mold was created from clay models and cast in high-fired porcelain using techniques learned from his years of experimental work. The glaze that covered the porcelain was a compound of Hemsley's own invention. containing minerals and pigments designed to mimic the appearance of living human skin. The apprentices further testified that on the night of December 18th, Hemsley placed his dying wife in a specially constructed chamber, that he applied the porcelain mask to her face while she was still alive, and that he heated the chamber to high temperature to fuse the ceramic to her skin and seal the transformation. Elena felt the world tilt slightly. She opened her eyes, Ashworth read, his voice trembling slightly with age and emotion. After the chamber cooled, she opened her eyes and wept, and the tears were not water but liquid glass, because she could not weep as a human any more. Hemsley's apprentices were horrified. They wanted to destroy what he had created, but Hemsley would not allow it. He said she would live forever now. She would never fade. She would never die. And for 30 years he kept her in his studio, re-photographing her, retouching the glaze when it cracked, maintaining her as an artist maintains a sculpture. The magistrate, faced with this testimony, chose to seal the records and order the apprentices to silence. He believed that bringing this matter to trial would be impossible, would destroy the credibility of the law itself. Robert Ashworth closed the diary and looked at Elena with eyes that seemed to have seen something in the past 130 years that had never left him. "There's more," he said. "My father wrote about what happened in 1901. The apprentices, who had never forgotten what they witnessed, decided to end it. They set the fire deliberately. They wanted to destroy the studio and everything in it. But Hemsley's creation, the transformed woman, she survived. How, my father did not know. But he wrote that she was seen afterward sometimes, in the years after the fire. Glimpses, sightings, always in white, always exactly as she had been preserved." "The weddings," Elena said. "The photographs spanning decades. That wasn't something that happened naturally. Someone was taking her photograph deliberately, recreating her at different moments in time, with different partners, as if she was being reborn. Each time she was captured by the camera." "I believe so," Ashworth said. "My father speculated that collectors had discovered her, artists, people who understood what she was, not a woman, but a work of art, a sculpture that had been made to resemble a woman. And they exploited her for their own purposes, re-photographing her, creating new identities for her, each time the glaze cracked enough that the cracks needed to be restored and she needed to be remade." Elena asked if she could photograph the diary entries. Ashworth agreed, and she carefully photographed each page with her phone, creating a digital record of the testimony that had been sealed away for over 130 years. As she prepared to leave, Ashworth handed her something else. It was an old envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a letter, written in a careful feminine hand, dated 1899. "My father found this among his papers many years later," Ashworth explained. "He believed it was written by Clara Hemsley herself. It was discovered in a crack in the studio wall after the fire. My father kept it secret for over 70 years, but I think now that you should read it." The letter was brief but devastating in its clarity. "To the person who finds this, I do not know when these words will be read, or if they ever will be read at all. But I must attempt to speak even though I no longer have a voice. Arthur has sealed me in porcelain, and I cannot die, and I cannot live. I am cold inside this glaze, so very cold. I remember the moment of the transformation, the heat of the chamber, the sensation of the ceramic being pressed against my dying skin, the way the kiln fire burned and never cooled. He said I would never wither. He said I would be perfect forever. But perfection is a prison made of love. He did this because he could not bear to lose me. But in saving me, he has lost me entirely. I am no longer Clara. I am no longer myself. I am only an image, only a face, only a beautiful eternal trap. Tell them, whoever reads this, tell them that when they see my face in photographs, they do not see beauty, they see ash. They see the desperate love of a man who could not accept that all things must end. They see the tragedy of immortality, which is that it is not immortality at all, but only a very slow death that lasts forever. The kiln never cooled. It continues to burn even now inside this porcelain prison, and I feel its heat with every moment. I beg you, whoever you are, whenever you read this, do not admire me. Do not restore my image. Do not make me beautiful again. Let me rest. Let me finally rest. Clara Elena sat holding the letter for a long time without speaking. The words seemed to vibrate in the air around her, carrying a weight that transcended time and medium. This was not history anymore. This was testimony. This was a voice from beyond the grave, a woman who had been trapped between life and art for over a century, pleading across the decades to be heard, to be understood, to be finally released. My father, Ashworth said quietly, believed that the letter was authentic. He believed that Clara, transformed into porcelain, had somehow found a way to communicate. He kept it sealed, but not because he wished to hide the truth. He kept it sealed because he feared that if people knew what had really happened, if they understood that a woman had been deliberately transformed, that she had been suffering in that state for all those years, the revelation would destabilize everything they believed about the nature of consciousness, mortality, art, and love. "Why are you telling me this now?" Elena asked. "Because you have the technology to restore her voice," Ashworth said. "You have the digital tools that my father lacked. You have the ability to connect all the fragments, the photographs, the records, the testimony, the letter, and make them into a coherent narrative. And because I am old, and I will not live much longer, and this secret has weighed on my family for generations, it needs to be released now into the light, while I am still here to tell you that it is true." Elena left Whitby with the letter and the diary entries, and she returned to Durham to a discovery that stopped her heart. While she had been away, the archive where she worked had experienced a series of technical anomalies. Files had been moved between servers without authorization. Digital backups had been corrupted and then restored. And, most disturbingly, new images had appeared in the collection. Photographs dated from years after the last known wedding, from decades in the 20th century, photographs that should not have existed. In one photograph, dated 1945, the bride appeared again, in another white dress with another groom. In 1962, another wedding. In 1981, in 2003. Each image was identical to the previous ones, the bride never aging, never changing, her porcelain face perfectly preserved, her expression eternally serene. The photographs had been uploaded to the archive system automatically, as if something was actively restoring her presence in the historical record. When Elena mentioned this to her supervisor, Dr. Helena Marsh, the response was cautious. "We've been investigating the server anomalies," Marsh said carefully. "Our IT team believes we experienced a sophisticated infiltration, possibly malicious code designed to corrupt the database. But the photographs themselves, they're curious. When we traced their origin, we found that they came from dozens of different sources, all across the internet. Wedding archives, family collections, museum databases, private photo collections. They were scattered across the digital world, fragments of the same face appearing in different places, all uploaded to our archive in a coordinated fashion." "That's impossible," Elena said. "Someone would have to deliberately search for and compile all of these images." "Yes," Marsh agreed. "That's what I said initially. But our IT specialist found something unusual in the code. The uploads didn't come from a human source. They came from an automated system that appeared to be scanning the internet. searching for images matching certain facial recognition parameters, and then uploading them to our archive, as if something was actively engaged in the process of restoring itself to the historical record. Elena felt the world shift beneath her feet again. She returned to her workstation and pulled up the latest wedding photographs that had appeared in the collection. She examined them with the restoration software, and what she saw made her pull back from the keyboard in shock. The photographs were changing, not subtly, but visibly. Each time she opened one, the image had been enhanced slightly. The bride's face was becoming clearer, the fractures in the porcelain becoming less visible, the detail and sharpness increasing with each iteration. It was as if the restoration program was being run continuously, over and over, and each time it was being applied, it brought the bride's image further into clarity, further into focus, and in some of the later photographs, the bride was no longer looking away from the camera. She was looking directly into the lens. Her eyes were open. Her expression had changed, no longer serene but aware, alert, present. Elena ran a detailed comparison between the earliest photograph from 1897 and the most recent one, supposedly from 2025. When she overlaid them, accounting for the century of technological change between them, she saw something that made her entire body go cold. The bride had grown older in the recent photographs. Not much, but noticeably. Her face showed subtle signs of aging, a slight loosening of the porcelain around the jawline, the faintest indication of lines around the eyes. It was as if the restoration program, in bringing the images into clarity, was simultaneously allowing her to age. As if by restoring her to visibility, the world was beginning to restore her to time itself. Elena began to document everything meticulously. She created a comprehensive timeline of all 672 wedding photographs that had appeared in the archive, dating from 1897 to 2025. She compiled the testimony from Robert Ashworth's father's diary, the sealed inquest records, the letter from Clara herself. She created a detailed analysis showing the progression from perfect porcelain preservation to subtle, barely perceptible aging. And then she did something she knew might be reckless. She ran the restoration program one final time on all the photographs simultaneously, combining them into a single composite digital image, a kind of temporal collapse that merged all instances of the bride across the entire span of years into one cumulative portrait. What emerged on her screen made her understand, finally and completely, what had been happening. The composite image showed a woman, the same woman, always the same woman, moving through time. In the earliest images, she was perfectly preserved, locked in porcelain, eternal. But as the composite progressed forward through the decades, her face showed signs of the years passing. The porcelain began to show cracks, the glaze faded, the carefully applied pigmentation started to flake and deteriorate. The woman who never aged was, in fact, aging. She was simply aging so slowly, so imperceptibly, that a single human lifetime was insufficient to perceive the change. But over the span of more than a century, the change was undeniable. The bride was not eternal. She was simply very, very slowly dying. And as Elena realized this, as the full tragedy of the situation crystallized in her mind, the archive's computer systems suddenly violently crashed. Every monitor in the building flashed white. The sound of static filled the air. Alarms began to sound. When power was restored 15 minutes later, half of the wedding photographs were gone, deleted, erased from the archive, but not all of them. A selection had been preserved, scattered across the servers, isolated as if deliberately protected, and one photograph remained on Elena's monitor. It was dated January of 2025, just 9 months prior, and it showed the bride in a wedding dress, standing at an altar beside a man Elena did not recognize, but the detail in the photograph was extraordinary, sharper and clearer than any of the previous images, and the bride was looking not at her groom, but directly at the camera. Her porcelain face, aged almost imperceptibly, wore an expression that was no longer serene. It was an expression of heartbreak, of resignation, of a woman who had finally accepted that perfection was not possible, that love could not save you from time, that beauty would always, eventually, fail. Below the photograph Elena saw was a single line of text that had not been there before. It was written in a flowing feminine hand, "Thank you for remembering me." Elena did not sleep for 3 days. She worked through the night in the archive lab, cross-referencing every scrap of evidence, reading and rereading the sealed inquest testimony, staring at the photographs until her eyes burned. And on the morning of the 3rd day, with the sun rising over Durham's medieval cathedral in the distance, Elena made a decision. She would put together an exhibition, not just an archive record, not a dry historical document, but a genuine exhibition of Clara's story, the full story, unfiltered, unedited, exactly as it had happened across the centuries. She began the work of compilation immediately. She created display boards showing the marriage records and death certificates of the 6 grooms. She mounted the restored wedding photographs in sequence, showing the progression of years, the subtle aging, the tragedy of a woman frozen in perfection and forced to watch it crack. She transcribed the sealed inquest testimony and placed it in protected cases. She included the diary entries from Robert Ashworth's father. She placed the original letter from Clara in a climate-controlled display case, where it could be read by anyone who wished to see it. And at the center of the exhibition, she placed a single digitally restored image, the composite temporal collapse that showed Clara's entire preserved existence condensed into a single face, a single portrait that captured 128 years of imperceptible change. The exhibition opened on a Thursday evening in March of 2025 in the University of Durham's East Gallery. It was titled simply, "For Clara Hemsley, who endured the kiln of love." The response was unexpected. News outlets picked up the story. Art critics and historians began examining the evidence. Museums from across the world contacted Elena, asking if they could mount traveling versions of the exhibition. Universities began offering courses examining the intersection of art, mortality, technology, and obsession through the lens of Clara's story. But more than that, something else began to happen. As the story of Clara Hemsley, the woman preserved in porcelain, the bride who never aged, the victim of love transformed into art, became public knowledge, other artifacts began to surface. Museums that had possessed documents or photographs related to Arthur Hemsley but had never understood their significance began coming forward. A collection of Hemsley's personal journals was donated to the archive. Letters between Hemsley and other artists and collectors of the era were discovered. A daguerreotype portrait of Clara dated 1896, the day before her transformation, showing her smiling, vital, alive. And most remarkably, a series of watercolor paintings were found in an attic in Manchester. They were labeled simply "Restoration Studies," and they depicted, in detail, the process of Clara's preservation. They showed her face being remade, refined, painted with infinite care by someone who clearly loved her and was desperate to keep her beautiful. They were brutal and heartbreaking and undeniably human in their intention. The work of a man whose love had curdled into obsession, who could not accept the natural order and had attempted to defy death itself through the medium of art. Elena found herself becoming, almost accidentally, the primary scholar of Clara Hemsley's life and afterlife. She gave lectures, she published papers, she collaborated with conservators and chemists who helped her understand exactly what techniques Hemsley had used, what materials, what methods of fusing ceramic to skin without killing the living woman beneath. But the question that haunted her most was the one she could not answer. Had Clara consented? Had she understood what he was planning to do, and had she chosen this fate over the slow death of her disease? Or had she been transformed without full understanding of the consequences, made into art without being asked? The truth, Elena realized, was that it did not matter. Either way, Clara's story was one of sacrifice to human obsession. Either way, she had been imprisoned by love. By the autumn of 2025, Elena had decided that the wedding photographs themselves, the original prints, the digital copies, the entire archive of Clara's preserved image needed to be released to the public domain. They needed to stop being secrets, stop being mysteries, stop being the property of institutions or collectors. They needed to be, simply and completely, memory, public memory, shared history. She worked with the archive's legal team to navigate the copyright questions. She worked with museums and private collectors to obtain permissions. And on the 1st of November, 2025, exactly 128 years after Clara's first wedding photograph had been taken, Elena uploaded the complete collection to a newly created digital archive, the Clara Hemsley Project. The archive was not a curated exhibition. It was a complete, unfiltered collection of every photograph they could find, every document, every scrap of evidence that related to Clara's story. Viewers could access the images in sequence or randomly. They could read the testimony. They could examine the AI analysis. They could see, if they wished, the exact moment in the composite portrait where Clara's perfect preservation began to crack under the weight of time. Within 48 hours, the archive had received over 2 million views from around the world. Within a week, it was trending on social media. Artists began creating new works inspired by Clara's story. Musicians released albums inspired by the tragedy. Novelists contacted Elena, asking permission to adapt the story. Filmmakers expressed interest in creating a feature film. And then, on a quiet Tuesday morning in her apartment, Elena's computer received a message. It appeared in her email inbox from a sender listed only as Archive Administrator, and it contained no words, only an image. It was a photograph, and it appeared to be from the present day. It showed a woman in a white dress standing in a museum gallery. Behind her, on the wall, was displayed one of the wedding photographs from 1897. The woman in the photograph appeared to be looking at the photograph on the wall, the photograph of herself, 128 years in the past. The woman's face was porcelain, fractured, aged almost imperceptibly across nearly a century and a quarter. But her expression was no longer resigned. It was peaceful. Her eyes, staring at her own past self, held something that Elena recognized as acceptance. Below the image, a line of text had been added. She has seen me now. She has remembered me. Perhaps now I can finally rest. Elena stared at the image for a long time. She ran it through every analysis tool she had. The metadata was corrupted, the origin untraceable. It could have been a hoax, a clever photo manipulation, a work of art inspired by Clara's story. But Elena knew, with a certainty that transcended rational explanation, that it was real, that somehow, across the digital networks that connected all the archive servers, across the quantum spaces where data lived and moved, Clara had reached through the years and shown herself. One final time, one final confirmation of her existence. Elena printed the image. She added it to the archive's collection, labeled simply as Self-Portrait Date Unknown. She added a brief caption, the last known image of Clara Hemsley believed to have been captured in the year 2025. The photograph demonstrates the cumulative effect of a century and a quarter of aging. Despite the preservation techniques that had frozen her in perfect stasis, she appears at peace. In the weeks that followed, the archive began to stabilize. The technical anomalies ceased. The files stopped uploading themselves. The corrupted data resolved. It was as if, by finally bringing Clara's story into the light, by making her real, by allowing her to be seen and remembered and understood, something had shifted. Something had been released. Elena continued her work as a scholar, but she also began something new. She started an annual lecture series on the subject of beauty, mortality, and the price of preservation. She worked with archivists and historians to establish best practices for digital preservation that would not, like Arthur Hemsley's porcelain, trap and distort the stories they were meant to protect. She became an advocate for understanding art not as the possession or creation of one individual, but as the shared responsibility of communities to hold and honor the stories of those who had lived before. And on the anniversary of Clara's death, January 10th, 2026, a year after Elena had first discovered the wedding photograph in the attic archive, she returned to Whitby. She stood on the cliffs overlooking the harbor where the Hemsley studio had once stood, where the fire had burned in 1901, where the transformation had occurred in 1898. The wind was strong, carrying the smell of salt and stone. Elena thought about Clara Hemsley, frozen for so long in porcelain and photographs, finally released through the medium of digital restoration and public memory. She thought about Arthur Hemsley, whose love had been so catastrophic that it had transformed his wife from a person into an artwork, from a woman into an eternal, unchanging symbol. She thought about the grooms who had died, about the collectors who had exploited Clara's image, about the apprentices who had tried to destroy her, about the magistrate who had sealed her story away from the world. She thought about the power of obsession and love and the impossible human desire to preserve beauty against the relentless passage of time. And then Elena understood, finally, what the true tragedy of Clara's story was. It was not that she had been transformed into porcelain. It was not that she had been trapped in photographs and forced to marry ghost grooms in 1,000 different timelines. It was that everyone had treated her story, her actual lived experience, her suffering, her voice, as if it was less real than the photographs, less important than the art. Her transformation into porcelain had been tragic, but no more tragic than the centuries in which her humanity had been repeatedly, systematically denied. In seeking to preserve her beauty, Arthur Hemsley had destroyed her humanity, and for 128 years, the world had compounded that destruction by continuing to see her as an object, a mystery, an artwork, rather than as a woman whose story needed to be understood, honored, and released. Until now. Elena opened a small notebook and wrote a final entry in her research on Clara Hemsley. Beauty endures, memory endures, but humanity does not survive in porcelain, and immortality is not the same as being remembered. What Clara Hemsley teaches us is that the most profound act of preservation is not to trap something in time, but to release it, to allow it to age, to change, to be transformed by the years, to allow it to move beyond the confines of one person's vision or one person's love, to let it become, finally, a shared inheritance, a story that belongs not to the man who created it, but to all of us who will read it, remember it, and in remembering, honor the woman whose fractured face is etched in porcelain and photographic emulsion across 128 years of human history. Clara Hemsley did not endure because her face was perfectly preserved. She endured because someone finally, 128 years later, remembered her as human. Elena closed the notebook and stood for a long moment on the cliffs, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and gray and loss. Below her, the ocean moved in eternal rhythm, eroding the cliffs stone by stone, year by year, carving away the land beneath her feet. It was a process of slow destruction, inevitable and absolute. And yet it was also, Elena realized, a process of profound beauty. The cliffs were not diminished by their erosion. They were transformed by it. Changed, yes, diminished in dimension, but also released. Their stone would become sand, would become the floor of the ocean, would be carried across the world, and become part of something new. Their destruction was also their release into a larger, grander story. Perhaps that was the truth that Arthur Hemsley had never understood. Perhaps that was the truth that made Clara's story not a cautionary tale about the destructiveness of obsessive love, but a meditation on what it means to let go, to allow time to do its work, to understand that the most beautiful preservation is not the preservation of an object in perfect stasis, but the preservation of a story allowed to grow, to change, to be retold across generations until it becomes something larger than any single person's vision of it. The kiln had indeed never cooled. The heat of obsession, the fire of desperate love, had continued to burn inside Clara's porcelain prison for 128 years. But finally, through memory, through restoration, through the simple human act of bearing witness, that heat had transformed into something else. Not destruction, but release. Not imprisonment, but remembrance. And as the sun set over Whitby, painting the harbor in shades of rust and shadow, Elena understood that she had not solved the mystery of Clara Hemsley. No one could. The mystery was not meant to be solved. It was meant to be lived with, honored and passed on. A fractured reflection of what it means to love so intensely that you would attempt to make eternity itself bow to your will, and what happens when eternity, inevitably, refuses.